the most feared warriors in the world, the Mongol army. They are known as one of the most ruthless, disciplined, and deadly forces in history. But how did these soldiers really live? Beyond the horrors of the battlefield, their daily lives were just as difficult as their wars. A life of punishment, hunger, disease, and constant surveillance. In this video, we will uncover the darkest truths that Mongol soldiers had to face. You will see the pain, fear, and resilience behind the war stories, It was not just the fear of death, but the very nature of death itself that terrified them. Get ready, because these harsh truths, lost in the dusty pages of history, will rewrite all the heroic tales you know. Punishments were extremely severe. In the Mongol army, discipline meant survival. However, the price of this discipline was so high that sometimes even the slightest mistake was punished by death. According to historical sources, those who did not obey the rules in Genghis Khan's army, such as those who moved too slowly and caused the battle to be lost, or those who disobeyed orders, were immediately and ruthlessly executed. For example, in the units commanded by the famous Mongol general Subaide, soldiers who made mistakes during battle were punished by being trampled under the hooves of horses. This was a terrifying method used both to demonstrate how strict discipline was and to prevent other soldiers from making the same mistake. Additionally, sometimes even innocent soldiers were publicly executed by being hung from a tent pole as a result of an enemy report or a misunderstanding. These punishments created enormous pressure on the soldiers, not only physically, but also psychologically. Everyone knew that discipline meant survival, but the limits of this discipline constantly bordered on death. Therefore, Mongol soldiers were victims who were crushed under orders, but also felt their lives were constantly under threat. Being under constant surveillance. The Mongol army was structurally very systematic, and soldiers kept a close watch on each other. A hierarchical system was established, starting with groups of 10 and extending to groups of 101,000. This structure was designed not only for battle tactics, but also to prevent soldiers from deserting or betraying their comrades. Historical sources report that if a soldier attempted to desert, the entire group to which he belonged would be punished. For example, in the 13th century, a Mongol unit faced punishment for the entire 10-person squad after one soldier deserted. This situation meant that individual mistakes affected the entire team, creating an atmosphere of constant fear and surveillance among the soldiers, rather than mutual trust. Another example is mentioned in Marco Polo's travels, where he describes the horrific effects of this system. Polo describes how Mongol soldiers performed almost every action in fear due to the constant control and pressure they exerted on one another. No one could fully trust anyone else, as even a minor mistake could endanger the lives of the entire unit. This situation created an environment of deep paranoia, despite the fact that they appeared to be bound by a brotherhood oath. Shamans and prophecies determined military strategy. Another element as important as reason and technique in Mongol war strategies was the prophecies of shamans. Shamans would make prophecies to determine the fate of war based on signs such as celestial bodies, dreams, natural phenomena, and the flight paths of birds. These prophecies sometimes had the power to completely change the movements of the army. For example, it is recorded that Kublai Khan, one of Genghis Khan's generals, withdrew his army after his shamans declared, "It is unlucky to fight today," and a few days later, the battle took place, resulting in heavy losses for those who participated. Such prophecies not only affected tactical decisions, but also deeply influenced the morale and psychology of the soldiers. Additionally, there are accounts of some soldiers in the Mongol army being sacrificed by shamans to prevent bad luck. These horrific rituals instilled in the soldiers the fear that they were not only facing the enemy's sword, but also a curse from the heavens. The shaman's words were accepted as the will of God, and challenging them was nearly impossible. Hygiene and disease were major problems. The Mongol soldiers' weakest point was not the battlefield, but their health conditions. During the long winter months, the lack of clean water and proper nutrition led to the spread of many diseases. Diseases such as lice, scabies, and dysentery were widespread in the army, and many soldiers lost their lives to these diseases. One historical document notes that many soldiers died from disease during the Mongol army's westward advance in the 1240s. Wounded soldiers' injuries often became infected as medical knowledge was limited. Instead of cleaning wounds, they were typically cauterized with heated iron, which caused additional pain. Additionally, due to long journeys and war conditions, soldiers were unable to maintain proper hygiene. This created an environment conducive to the rapid spread of diseases. Thus, diseases contributed to the deaths of Mongol soldiers as much as the blows of swords on the battlefield. It was not the fear of death, but the horrific manner of death. For Mongol soldiers, death was often sudden and dishonorable. However, the real fear was the manner of death. Escaping soldiers who were caught were punished with extremely cruel and slow tortures, such as being buried alive. For example, in the 13th century, Mongol military units that attempted to rebel were executed in this manner along with their leaders, and these executions were deliberately carried out in public to intimidate the entire army. It did not matter whether one was guilty or not. Suspicion was sufficient. In his travels, Marco Polo detailed how brutal and terrifying the death penalties in the Mongol Empire were. Courage, physical strength, and strategy were not enough to save one's life. To survive, absolute obedience and a great deal of luck were required. The moment of death was unknown in advance. Only the manner of death was the soldier's greatest nightmare. Nutrition was not a priority. For Mongol soldiers, nutrition on the battlefield consisted of foods that were easily accessible and provided quick energy. However, these foods were often tasteless, monotonous, and unhealthy. Historians note that the Mongols primarily subsisted on dried meat, stored in freezing cold conditions, and arag, a beverage made from horse milk. For example, during a campaign, a Mongol soldier, unable to find fresh food for an extended period, would typically have to consume only dried meat and occasionally milk mixed with blood. This diet could lead to digestive issues, fatigue, and even illness. The lack of dietary variety weakened the immune system due to vitamin deficiencies. Additionally, there was insufficient time and environment to prepare food. Meat was often quickly cooked directly over a fire or embers. Spices and seasoning were almost non-existent. As a result, soldiers' morale remained low, and their bodies grew weak due to constant malnutrition. The Mongol army's harsh diet did not make them physically strong, but it increased their endurance and ability to adapt to campaigns. However, this became one of the main causes of health problems in the long term. Life was constantly on the move. The Mongols' life was literally constantly on the move. Permanent settlements were rare. The army was highly mobile and fast-moving. Historical records show that the Mongol army traveled hundreds of kilometers a year, sometimes spending weeks without setting up camp, sleeping outdoors in the open air. This harsh lifestyle greatly limited the soldiers' opportunities for rest and recovery. Even when they set up camp, there was no comfort. In winter, they had to endure the cold, and in summer, they had to contend with dust and insects. According to Marco Polo's writings, the Mongol camp was usually dusty and filthy, with hygiene nearly non-existent. Constant travel also took a toll on the soldiers' mental health. Being separated from their families, homes, and familiar way of life for extended periods of time demoralized many soldiers. Additionally, the fatigue, hunger, and illnesses experienced during campaigns led to an accumulation of individual and collective hardships. The Mongols' ability to move quickly gave them a great advantage in battle, but this advantage was gained at the expense of the soldiers' individual quality of life. Constant campaigning wore them down both physically and mentally. Religious rules and duties. Mongol soldiers were bound not only by their swords, but also by their beliefs and religious duties. Shamanism was the dominant religion in the early days of the Mongol Empire, and its rituals deeply permeated the daily lives of soldiers. The ceremonies, prophecies, and spirit summonings performed by shamans before each battle not only boosted morale, but also determined the army's decisions and movements. For example, Genghis Khan would always seek approval from spiritual leaders before sending his army into battle. Shamans would choose the most appropriate time for battle, based on signs from the heavens, and decide which soldiers could and could not participate. This religious devotion served as both a source of strength and, at times, a test for the soldiers. Some rituals were arduous and demanding. Soldiers would fast for extended periods, avoid certain foods, and pray collectively at specific times. Those who violated religious rules risked not only divine wrath, but also expulsion from the army or punishment. In this context, religion for Mongol soldiers was not merely a matter of personal belief. It was an integral part of the rules governing survival, warfare, and social standing. This increased the pressure on them, making their already difficult lives even more complex. The horror of hot and cold climates. Throughout history, Mongol soldiers have waged campaigns in different geographical regions, but neither the scorching heat of the sun nor the freezing cold came easily to them. The climate was not the enemy of war, but it was one of the greatest enemies of the soldiers. Especially the freezing cold of Siberia or the scorching summer months of Central Asia took a toll on the Mongol army, both physically and mentally. During the campaign in Iran in the 1220s, many soldiers lost their lives due to cold and starvation, either freezing to death or falling ill. In one campaign, it was documented that even horses could not stand in the extreme heat, and soldiers fainted from thirst. Walking under hot conditions in areas with scarce water sources significantly reduced the soldiers' strength. In response, the Mongols developed practical solutions to adapt to the natural environment. For example, in cold climates, they used thick fur and animal skin garments, while in hot regions, they preferred lightweight, breathable clothing. However, despite all these precautions, climatic conditions remained a major threat to the soldiers. Climate also played an important role in determining war strategies. Many campaigns were postponed or changed direction depending on weather conditions. Thus, for Mongol soldiers, hot and cold were not just natural conditions, but a fine line between life and death. As you can see, the lives of Mongol soldiers were not limited to victories won on the battlefield. They had to live with death at their doorstep at all times, struggling with hunger, disease, and ruthless discipline. But perhaps the hardest part was living without knowing when or how death would come, always on alert. For them, the real fear was not death itself, but the form it would take. If you want to delve deeper into this dark and challenging world, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. We'll continue to explore the most fascinating and least known aspects of history together. See you in the next video.